What's dark and grim, yet a symbol of hope and salvation? That's, of course, we'll be talking about the continuation of the Batman saga from a darker lens. I'm John Chang, Dan Edmonds.
Hello there.
And yeah, I think this time around, one of the things that comes up more is I feel like, what is it about, like, kind of the why was this trend for something darker? I guess we've kind of covered it a little bit, but I feel like it's maybe related to a little bit of the fourth turning and a little bit of like kind of just people's taste being a little more sophisticated. Or
Yeah, I've been racking my brains over this because we're looking at these. So just to reiterate, we've been looking at the 1966 Batman, the 1989 Tim Burton Batman, the 2005 Christopher Nolan, and the new 2022 by Matt Reeves was the director anyway. So I mean, from the way I see it, each of these has very distinct styles and the way they treat some of the content over the different decades. You can look at it as a way of how we deal with escapism. Like in the 1960s, it was a very kind of colorful cartoon overlay, bright, sort of slightly whimsical, but funny. Then in the 80s, that becomes a more kind of gothic fantasy with almost sort of subtle supernatural overtones. Then by the time you get to the 2000s, we've got it's highly, there's a lot more emphasis on realism. The locations are now real places, they're not fantasy locations. Bruce Wayne, the only way they can even really push, or the way the story is set up to push what is real and what is not, is just by the sheer power of Bruce Wayne's fortune, in that you can create something like the Batmobile just by the virtue of him being very, very rich, and that he can do something where he's got some elaborate base jumping equipment that will allow him to do these things. So in a way you can and now with the newest one in 2022, the realism now extends to Bruce Wayne as well, and the fact that now he doesn't really have these amazing toys and everything else that would cost billions of dollars. It's a very the realism has been kind of finely tuned, and I would say darker, not necessarily. In some ways, I would say the Tim Burton one's somewhat darker than some of the newer ones, but still, I mean, it's in terms of why it becomes darker and more realistic. I think it's to do with mental illness fundamentally. I think the core of Batman is actually a reflection of how we look at and accept mental illness and eccentricity in society. Because if you think about the 1960s Batman, most of the villains in that are kind of laughing and sort of up to sort of mischief, but they're not lethal. They're never really actually like killing anyone. And even Batman is kind of, he's sort of obsessive compulsive about his morality and things like this. So he's also, you can tell there's something sort of psychologically wrong with him because he's a bit too robotic, but that's kind of part of the appeal. But it was all kind of like done in good sort of, good humor, we'll say. By the time you get to the 80s almost the 90s, basically, it's kind of like it becomes more of a counterculture expression, because you have the Joker, who's kind of into abstract art in a way and causing sort of chaos. You have Catwoman, who's basically sort of a BDSM style person, and then you've got the Penguin is kind of just like slightly damaged from a bad childhood. But it isn't sort of, still it's kind of, it doesn't have the level of criminal kind of psychopathy that you then see in characters, like the Joker, who when we're introduced to him, he's just sort of, he's created this elaborate plan and then it's just gunning people down as he's working with them, and he finishes. I mean, absolute, complete psychopathic lack of empathy there. More and that you could say also with Batman Begins, Ra's al Ghul is being saved. He's sort of, he comes back from the brink of death and then decides to go back and kill an entire city of people. And then in 2022, it then becomes the case of, is Batman upholding the corrupt establishment really the sane person, or is he the one that's got the problems, and it's actually the people who are out on the street fighting and killing these corrupt people, are they actually, the same ones? So I think it's become more of an exploration of how we deal with mental illness in a way. And I think as the more we are exposed to this and the more we see it in our media, the more we realize how troubled these people are. I'm not saying it's an accurate portrayal of mental illness, but I would say that may be why there's this shift, because I think it's almost like some kind of a crash course in psychology and how dysfunctional behavior, really, how you kind of expose. It's probably the first exposure that people get to psychologically damaged people in any kind of media, I would say.
And I really wonder if how much of it is the way the narrative is handled by the media, over time and stuff. Because like you said, probably, in, let's say, the 50s and 60s and stuff, mental illness was treated as like kind of just something that, like, when people were sent to this funny farm, right? And it was literally even called the funny farm, because it was like kind of the thing that, like, people were strange, but it was like, it's they're just damaged goods, and kind of, like, it's not, as much as part of society as we started to see probably in the 70s. Is probably, like, movies like The Taxi Driver really showed how, like, they're really just among us. And I think over time, there was this kind of idea that, like, actually, they're not only among us, but they could pop up at any time. It's this idea of people going postal and stuff.
Yeah. That's a very much it seems to be a much more of an American fear, I would say, in terms of the height of fear around psychological problems is definitely raised, especially when the single man shootings happening in cinemas and things like this.
Yeah, in fact, that even happened in one of the Batman openings and stuff. I think it might have.
It's Dark Knight Returns. Someone who even dressed up a bit like him. So funny when people say that media doesn't have an influence, and he was basically dressed as the Joker and went and gunned down a load of people. It's like, it's definitely a connection there. But anyway, it's just one of those things where people don't want to accept that the fun stuff that they enjoy also can influence damaged people in some way. And I think that's also probably one of Batman's failings, really. If you look at it, is probably we all kind of think that the people who behave like the criminals in Batman are criminally insane, when they probably don't really fit the criteria of having proper mental disorders, the way their characters are portrayed.
I think that's a great segue into like kind of today's two discussions, because part of the whole thing too, between the 2005 and 2022, most recent one stuff, is this idea that Batman's basically a vigilante. Like kind of like we talked about this in Death Wish. Like I mean, at what point is kind of like where do we draw the line between, okay, this is like a hero and this is like vigilante and stuff? I mean, they kind of, I feel like that's one of the things that, like, these recent versions touch on much more than the previous ones.
Yeah, and I think what's it's funny you mentioned Death Wish, because I kind of feel like that is what why the Joker is such an unsettling bad guy in the second. Not that we're supposed to be talking about the second one,
sure.
but it's the randomness of his killing, and that was what's so sort of like shocking about the opening scene in Death Wish, is that it's just a normal family, then all of a sudden their home is invaded, and and they're killed. And that's kind of what you get with the Joker. You never really quite understand his motivation, but it's the randomness that actually scares people. It's the lack of logic. And like with the Batman villains in the 60s, they were trying to steal something, or
Mhm.
they were trying to sort of get something. I mean, you know, or kidnap someone.
Right.
There was nothing just like, yeah, we're just going to mow down 20 people for no sake of it. And I mean, even the 1989 one, there was still, I mean, you could say Jack Nicholson's Joker kind of introduced this idea. His motivations were not really that clear, aside from kind of causing chaos. So I suppose, you know, that first place probably has to go to him for that in terms of the Batman series of movies. But yeah, I think that's fundamentally what scares people about.
But like, I'd say, you know, what we saw in the 89 one was that there was still like a little bit of an origin to his going unhinged and everything. It was kind of where, okay, he was, you know, kind of like he was somewhat psychopath, but then like it was only when he literally got pushed over the edge, you know, like kind of into this chemical vat, that then he, you know, like kind of became the Joker. Because before then he was just a criminal that was kind of had psychopathic tendencies and stuff, but he became the Joker after, you know, like this accident and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most, I mean, we may have talked about that last week, but I really think that's one of the most interesting ideas, is that it's not only that he gets physically disfigured, but his whole character is actually transformed in that he now wants to sort of toy with people's reality and start to sort of, you know, question the media and how that sort of portrays people with makeup. Is a really interesting kind of take on it. But going back to what you said of what causes some of this change, you know, in the 1950s, when you know, comics were made, you weren't actually allowed to show a story that was sympathetic to the villain. Like, you weren't actually allowed to do that. And I think with the advent of, say, the Vietnam War and people having televisions in their house more readily, a lot more of the sort of grim reality of heroic sort of exploits abroad and other sort of things were, you know, the Nixon, Watergate, all this kind of stuff, probably brought home to people the complexities of there's no clear right and wrong. Yeah. And, you know, and so I think that's probably what you see in it starts in the 60s TV show, in that there are sort of, they're quite sympathetic to Catwoman most of the time by virtue of her, you know, having a love interest with Batman. But, you know, they start to sort of like show both sides a little bit more. Yeah. And you see that in the 89 and 90s versions as well. Catwoman is quite sympathetic, really, as a character goes. Even Penguin, because you're shown his kind of troubled childhood. You know, Jack Nicholson's a Joker, not so much, but yeah, definitely Batman Returns is much more sympathetic to its villains. Definitely. Yeah.
So with the 2005 version, like here we have is, of course, Christopher Nolan directs it. Related, of course, to Jonathan Nolan, who we talked about extensively in Westworld. And yeah, definitely, I feel like he clearly wanted to make things kind of more serious, I guess, kind of like in a sense of that there's very, there's none of the camp, that we saw in the 60s version. And then it's kind of even more removed from the kind of the Tim Burton sensibilities in 89 and stuff like that. It's definitely like now we're seeing like kind of like Batman is serious business, kind of like this is a cinematic hero, and and of course he finds just the perfect person to execute that vision with Christian Bale and stuff as Bruce Wayne and Batman.
Yeah, I mean, Christian Bale's great because having sort of been a psychopath in American Psycho, who's sort of wealthy but also sort of charismatic and deadpan, he's perfect for the role, really. And I still find myself laughing at some of Christian Bale's lines in Batman Begins as Bruce Wayne. Just when I thought you were dead, it's like, sorry to disappoint. It's simple stuff like that. He does it much better than I can, obviously, but he just adds his own little sort of flair to even the most fairly innocuous lines in it. But I would say it's almost like he's said, okay, well, we've got this guy it's Christopher Nolan almost seems to have gone back and thought, what's the most sort of sensible and logical answer for why Batman would be the way he is? Well, he's got all these gadgets and things he throws. Well, okay, he's a ninja then. He must have been trained in ninjutsu, and they wear dark clothing. It all kind of makes, it's a very kind of pragmatic approach to how you would sort of build up this set of skills. And then by, just making him a billionaire, you can, as I said, you can fill in the gaps with any of the other stuff. So, but I think it's very clever the way they did that, And
at the same time, like you said, there is this kind of thing of like, okay, that's like obvious stuff. But then what is a very Nolan-esque kind of thing that we've seen, not only, between the two brothers and stuff, is this kind of, they have this joy of misdirection, because major spoilers always, who we assume to be, Ra's al Ghul, with Ken Watanabe, who we've also talked about before. He's like clearly, who you would imagine a Ra's al Ghul to look like, but meanwhile, it's actually, of course, Liam Neeson, who, kind of like, he's like, seems to be the de facto mentor guide and stuff like that, the Obi-Wan, if you will. But then, of course, deceptively turns out to be the actual, criminal mastermind behind it all.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, this is in the comics, I believe, at least from watching the cartoon, it seems like Ra's al Ghul has the ability to sort of make himself immortal and rebirth himself. No, but it was very, again, they took a very kind of practical approach to this in terms of, okay, well, we just change the identity of him and tell everyone who it is. But I thought it was a very clever sort of spin on that. Yeah, I mean, Liam Neeson's great as well, convincingly psychopathic as Ra's al Ghul. And yeah, I mean, it's a pretty kind of entertaining, because normally the origin parts of superheroes are pretty tedious, because you think, oh, I already know this, and but they actually made it pretty entertaining.
Yeah, I like what the critical drinker says in this video is, how many times do we need to see his parents gunned down in that alleyway?
Yeah,
it's so true though. We all know it by now. It's like, and it's like, okay, like after a while, it just feels like it's such a throwaway kind of thing and stuff. But speaking of throwaway, two roles that are throwaway, I feel like are really elevated by who's cast and stuff. Number one being Alfred Pennyworth, who, of course, is played by Michael Caine, that we talked about, of course, in Get Carter, Alfie, Italian Job. And he's definitely somebody who, like, makes it much more than just a fill-in-the-blank kind of role. And the other one being James Gordon, who, of course, was played by Gary Oldman, who we've seen in Dracula and Robocop. And once again, that, like, when he shows up, like, he's just this chameleon that really just slides into these roles and stuff.
Yeah, no, he's very understated in Batman Begins, but effective. He just adds some the drama and the sort of the requisite kind of hopelessness in this city that's kind of gone wrong. As the one good cop left in the town. I mean, I also thought I can't remember his name now. The main bad guy played by the English actor Tom
Carmine Falcone.
Falcone.
Tom Wilkenson.
Tom Wilkenson. Yeah. I mean, he adds a nice sort of convincing level of threat and conviction to his performance. True. To add that in. I mean, it's a great cast, really, all round.
Even Rutger Hauer does a turn as the slimy CEO of Wayne Enterprises. And then how can we forget, of course, Morgan Freeman as the Q to the Christian Bale, like as Lucius Fox and stuff. I mean, here's another actor who, like, takes his role that, like, probably would just normally be like, just somebody filling in stuff, and then he just brings this kind of charm and kind of like the bit of humor to it that, like, really is just makes it much more, this role much more than it has any right to be and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it takes away from it's sort of this idea that's established in the 60s show that, you know, Batman is a kind of a genius level detective as well, and kind of like creates all these amazing gadgets himself. You know, we're not doing any of that. He's got an entire department to take care of in this, in this one.
But like you said, it's much more believable because
I mean, the whole thing is like, how can we reverse engineer what we already know about Batman to make it a much more believable story? I mean, the one role I think is really unappreciated because is oh man, name escapes me.
Sure.
The love interest.
Rachel,
yes, Rachel,
played by Katie Holmes. She okay. I have to admit that, like, for me, I thought she was an odd choice. I felt like she was really out of her element. That's my personal feeling about it. And probably because I'm so used to seeing her in the role from Dawson's Creek that, like, I just can't unsee her. You know, like yeah.
Well, actually, I mean, I don't watch Dawson's Creek, but I actually thought she was really good in it, and I thought it was a shame when she was replaced by Maggie Gyllenhaal in
Interesting.
Dark Knight Returns.
So Maggie Gyllenhaal, you felt like was not, I guess, a better choice in that role and stuff.
I thought that, I don't know. You want this character to be sort of almost naively optimistic and believing that justice can be done to the courts, and I think Katie Holmes did that, and she sort of pulled off this kind of thing of someone who's very determined but isn't sort of naive of the real danger that's around her, but also sort of had this sort of odd mixture of kind of sympathy and disappointment in, you know, Bruce Wayne. So I thought she carried all of that off really well. And I kind of felt like when Maggie Gyllenhaal was in The Dark Knight Returns, she was just a bit too kind of cynical and removed from any kind of, you didn't feel there was that much of a connection between her and Bruce, whereas I felt there was more of that with Katie Holmes and Christian Bale.
I guess I felt that, like, somebody who was an assistant DA would be more cynical, and so I felt like, you know, like, how can somebody be that, you know, like, have that kind of you know, naive kind of faith and stuff like that. Maybe that is what kind of, you know, is needed, I guess. But I guess I felt like, I just felt like, you know, somebody couldn't be that
that young and that naive to be an assistant,
you know,
DA.
You know, I guess I just felt like that just kind of like was like kind of like, okay, what is, you know, how did she get there? That it's kind of, I felt like that was like, you know, like more of like a lot of times these more modern kind of movies where somebody is like kind of just magically like kind of, you know, the CEO of like a corporation, right? And like meanwhile they're like in their 20s or something like that, and it's like, you know, it just, I feel like we talked about that before, and I feel like that's kind of like what Katie Holmes, you know, like kind of more or less kind of seemed to fit the bill, I guess, for her and stuff.
Yeah. Oh well, I think you're probably right now, actually, on the believability scale. I mean, of course, let's not forget Cillian Murphy, I want to say, as the Scarecrow, who does a great job as well. And I mean, in terms of the Scarecrow and the way that's dealt with, again, this is kind of, I feel this is reflects a changing attitude towards drugs as well. Because in the 60s, you know, that Batman, there was, you know, every other week there was some sort of weird powder or formula that did something wacky, and it's kind of like that had, you know, the variety and things, but again, it never killed anyone. It just had a weird effect. It, you know, dehydrated people and turned them into powder and things like this, you know, as we saw in the movie. But it was never anything that threatening. I would say in a weird sort of way, I think the transformation that the Joker goes through in the 1989 movie is kind of a reference to drugs in a way. in that you've got someone who's already inherently bad and then becomes a bit more sort of weird and psychotic. It's almost like a that's kind of like the obvious thing, because it's also a kind of a transformative process that he goes through. He falls into some chemicals and comes out as something more dangerous and crazier. And likewise in this, you've got the main threat is a drug. But now, we've gone from completely non-lethal drugs in the 60s to ones that will permanently damage you and kill everyone in a city.
Definitely.
So it's interesting that, and the way that, Scarecrow's main weapon is drugs, basically.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely, the case where, it's now not only, just something that's not as harmless. It's also something that can be weaponized on a massive scale and stuff. It's definitely a much darker also image of drugs and
but interesting. And I mean, I guess this kind of preempts a lot of the the rise in addiction to sort of, what is it, painkillers and all this kind of stuff that has become a bit of an epidemic. But interestingly, in the 2022 version, there isn't really any not that I can remember. The only bit I can remember where they sort of reference anything that might be a drug is him, having like the adrenaline shot at the end to try and kind of fight off people. But there really wasn't any sort of mention of drugs or medication through that. Not that I can remember anyway.
Yeah,
it seems like people are just the world in Gotham is crazy enough to drive people mad as it is. They don't need to have some super drug or something to turn them mad. And of course, what is the main effect of this drug? It's to induce paralyzing fear. So it's very interesting in that respect.
One of the most memorable kind of moments was that when you start seeing the effects from the perspective of somebody who's under the influence, and now Batman not only looks like a giant bat, but kind of like a demon and everything. And then other times we see something that out of a horror movie, where worms kind of crawling out of Scarecrow's mask and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's very clever as well. They use glowing eyes. It's the main
that's
visual.
Right.
It's funny, isn't it? The sort of glowing eyes. It's funny. It's been used in many horror movies, and it's quite a clever trick in this. But although in a way, I kind of feel like it's an easy explanation for, people's derangement or criminal insanity in Batman. It's like, oh, the drugs did it. That's why, the Joker fell into a vat. It's the chemicals that did it. That's why he's like he is. And
but it's definitely like we've kind of started by saying is kind of that the how mental illness is kind of really shown as something that starts off being kind of these different individuals and stuff, but then next thing you know that then they're more or less infecting others kind of through this drug and stuff like that. I guess it now the more I think about it, it's almost like a statement of that where the criminal element is kind of using drugs as a way to kind of spread fear and kind of mental illness as kind of like this infectious kind of disease and stuff through the drugs.
And I think by the same, we always sort of see Bruce Wayne as someone who's sort of mentally unstable as well.
Right.
But I would say he's actually, but he's functional though, because even though he's been traumatized, he kind of transforms that trauma into something where he can not only kind of fight crime, but he can also kind of be an incredibly successful billionaire businessman as well. So he's not really, no matter how sort of unhinged he might be, he's not actually dysfunctional in any way. But the same you could also say of Ra's al Ghul. You could say, well, his motives are clearly psychopathic, but
Hmm.
he can get the job done. You know, he has a plan, he executes, so he can organize things. So he's right again. He's like, he's whatever his end goal might be, he's still very functional. He's not sort of, gibbering in a corner or something like this. It's
Right.
It's this weird thing of where you've got two protagonists who are both sort of have somewhat dubious aims and goals, but are highly functional, fighting against a sort of a drug that's turning everyone mad.
Mm.
But conversely, if you want to, compare it to the 2022 one.
Yeah,
Here.
I just wanted to kind of mention one kind of
sure, yeah.
Small cameo and stuff. Jackie Gleason, who is, of course, Joffrey Baratheon from Game of Thrones.
That's right. Yes,
is this kind of young boy who we see in a much more positive and kind of innocent light than, of course, the character he ultimately plays. I feel like this is kind of like one of those child actors. On the one hand, he did survive. It's one of the things we've talked about many times. But then after, I feel like the hate that he got in his more serious role, kind of that influenced him enough to kind of get out of the business.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That's what, because obviously this wasn't a bad experience for him.
No.
I watched Zatura with my daughter randomly.
Oh, okay.
Well, we started watching it and she got bored of it. But that's got Josh Hutcherson and like Kristen Stewart. It's like almost Twilight stroke Hunger Games kind of
interesting
thing. But it's I didn't even know either of them were acting that young. So they're obviously both kind of child stars who then went and did absolutely fine. So it's not an absolute concrete
no. We were just kind of wrapping up discussing the 2005 Batman Begins, and in the 2022 version, directed by Matt Reeves, who we've talked about briefly in Let Me In, and we indirectly talked about because he had also done the Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, which wasn't one of the ones we discussed in our Ape Week discussion.
It's an ape month, actually.
8 months.
We did a lot of aping that month, so it was all kind of like timely, though. There was GameStop, Wall Street Bets. It was an obvious sort of time to do it, in my opinion. But anyway, the 2022. I mean, for me, I don't know what you thought. I kind of enjoyed it, but maybe not quite as much as the Nolan ones. But I thought it was quite clever. I think one of the most interesting things for me was the way they dealt with the character of Bruce Wayne.
Okay.
Because you could the criticism you could sort of throw at the Christopher Nolan one in 2005 is that the bad guys are criminally insane, and the good guys are also kind of unhinged, but it's okay because they're billionaires, so it doesn't matter if they're crazy.
Yeah.
Right. In this, we actually kind of see something, again, the believability has been sort of ranked up another level, because we've got this now sort of traumatized Bruce Wayne, who is actually dysfunctional, whose sort of fortune is falling to pieces. He's not turning up and sort of involved in any of the business stuff, and is a recluse. He doesn't sleep and things like this. So I thought that was quite interesting, the way they did that, and they're trying to do a more, and it was weird in that it was so kind of realistic and believable that when he actually turned up and was sort of slowly walking through the police station in the Batman suit, you kind of thought, this just feels kind of awkward. It feels like, it feels like I'm watching CSI Miami and there's just a guy in a bat suit who's kind of turned up and he's walking around and we're supposed to take him seriously. And you had that. That was what was kind of interesting, in that you kind of got this, what I liked about it was this idea that Bruce Wayne really he didn't quite understand how removed from reality he was, in that he introduces himself and says, "I'm vengeance." And then you get, the other imposter or the guys who are working for the Riddler also saying, "Hey, I'm vengeance." And this gets, Zoe Kravitz, of her character as Catwoman, throws it back and, "Hey, you're vengeance, aren't you?" Kind of making fun of him in this idea of like, he's deluded himself by this idea that he's vengeance when he doesn't really he doesn't really quite understand what's happening, how his family got into this sort of situation with Falcone. And so that I thought was really good, the way they kind of portrayed him.
I think that's a great point, because it's something that we take for granted in the 66 and even partially in the 89, of where a little bit less in the 89, where like here's this guy dressed in a bat suit that we're supposed to take seriously as a crime fighter. You know, I mean, that's a basic premise that, like, you know, like, granted, as you know, comic fans or, you know, like kind of fans of, you know, like the superheroes, we take it for granted, like, oh, you know, or he's Batman, stuff like that. But I think what is highlighted in the 2022 version is the fact that, like, this guy's in a batsuit walking around, you know, like kind of with real crimes going on and stuff, people getting killed. And it's like, you know, how do we know he's not, you know, like a nut dressed up in a suit and stuff like that? And I think that's the thing that, like, we really see is like kind of that, like, it's not an assumption that you should take for granted. And you know, it's like kind of that. It's only over time that, like, he gets more credibility as like kind of he starts actually, you know, doing things that, like, gets him that level of trust, I guess, with the authorities. Yeah.
And I mean, you know, the Penguin is certainly not, you know, portrayed in the, you know, as with a sort of going and smoking with the cigarette holder or anything like that, and flapping about on his feet or anything. It's I
had no idea watching it the first time that it was Colin Farrell. I mean, you know, that like they you know, we talked about that with Dick Tracy, that, like, you know, there's so much makeup, but in this case it actually doesn't, like, this, you know, kind of hide as much the emoting stuff. But at the same time, you know, like a good question is, like, you know, like okay, if you're gonna put an actor under that much makeup and stuff, then, you know, what part of it is really Colin Farrell and stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't really only get that whole. I didn't really understand the casting, and I didn't really understand the makeup of why they were doing that. But anyway, he did it, and he did a pretty decent job. Going back to Dick Tracy very quickly, though, kind of a side note. You know, we talked about how the character of Batman evolved, we think, out of a kind of an extension of Dick Tracy as an idea, because he has the gadgets, he's a sort of a detective and this sort of thing. I think it's the mental illness element is the key thing that differentiates Batman and Dick Tracy. Because, you know, rather than having kind of slightly eccentric, weird looking criminals who are basically just evil in Dick Tracy, they are actually kind of supposed to be criminally insane in Batman. That's absolutely, like, you know, something that I guess I wasn't aware of it until the video game, actually, of this idea that there's this Arkham Asylum, and we actually, I guess we get a glimpse of this in this one too. That, like, it's something I don't think we really see that in the other Batman movies, huh? This asylum of you know, other. I'm trying to think if you see it. You might see it in one of the Joel Schumacher ones or something like that in the 90s. But I've only watched those once, never again. So I could be wrong. I mean, you see it quite a lot in the cartoon from the 90s. It does focus on Arkham Asylum quite a lot. But I mean, it's quite a central sort of piece of Batman lore, really, to Arkham Asylum, and it's interesting that we're kind of looking in this one at not only Bruce Wayne, who's a kind of a traumatized person, but we find out that his mother was, you know, in and out of Arkham Asylum, and I mean, Arkham Asylum itself is one of these places that seems more frightening than the villains who you know, who we were facing against. Is this kind of lawless you know, place for the criminally insane that seems worse than, you know, anything they could sort of mete out to people. So I think it symbolizes this place of where it's not just simply the insane being put away, but it's almost like a I don't know, like somewhere where, like, the insanity kind of festers in some ways. Because certainly we see a glimpse of the, you know, the possible, you know, sequel to this, you know, with the Joker, you know, like kind of having this conversation and with the Riddler and stuff. Yeah, absolutely. It hammers that point home pretty much the end, doesn't it? And I mean, I think from what I understand, the Arkham Asylum was introduced into the Batman comics in the 70s. Which, again, if you remember when we were looking back at Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you know, this idea that the psychologist was one of the key characters and people's motives were sort of constantly questioned by the psychologist of whether they were actually sane or whether they're insane. And so it seems like a very kind of apt time that they introduced this element into Batman, this idea that perhaps the cure is worse than the problem.
And I think, you know, it goes back to also how, as we talked about in Invasion, that that it was around that time we started seeing a lot more of this combination of the abnormal psychology separated from like the kind of things that now is kind of treated as part of pop culture of like kind of, you know, this you know, self-improvement kind of, you know, like in other words, that like not only is there's kind of like there's degrees and there's kind of different, you know, kind of shades of, you know, kind of you know, mental illness and stuff, but also the fact that like, you know, we all can improve, I guess. We all have ways that we can, you know, like kind of better ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that's actually going back to the 2022 version. I think that's something that comes across is actually that pretty much all the characters seem to be damaged in some way or another. You know, you have Bruce Wayne in his sort of traumatic childhood. You have Zoe Kravitz as the Catwoman character, who's kind of like this abandoned, again, sort of a victim of a bad childhood, with a completely sort of absent father who turns out to be someone that her mother works for. And again, it's, you know, the Riddler, you know, Paul Dano's character is again someone who's raised, you know, dysfunctionally in an orphanage, who which wasn't run well, and becomes a product of, you know, Bruce Thomas Wayne's initiative.
Right. Yeah, it's funny that you know, Paul Dano is like kind of we talked different times about casting, and like, you know, he's like the de facto, you know, if you want a psychopath in development, or kind of somebody who just seems naturally unhinged and stuff, when you just cast Paul Dano, and he doesn't even have to do much, and you already have that sense.
Yeah, he's pretty unhinged. Although, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I didn't really like him much as the Riddler.
Okay, interesting.
I mean, I felt like his performance was just like he was sort of slightly creepy and unhinged and talking like this, and then just started shouting randomly. Just kind of like, oh, right, okay, now I'm shouting, now I'm back to the other thing, being the sort of creepy fanboy character, and now I'm shouting again. And it's sort of like, it seemed a bit sort of, I don't know, needed a bit more depth, I think, to be honest with you. But I mean, he was only really in kind of one scene properly anyway, so yeah, likewise, again, it's like the Colin Farrell as the Penguin, it just kind of, I found kind of baffling. I thought, why do you have like an Irishman playing an American, and then you completely kind of cover his face up? And it was like, why not just find an American actor who just looks like the Penguin character that you've envisaged, and have him? It's not like Colin Farrell added something so unique that we've never seen in cinema before to that character, that justified that, really. I
don't know.
I mean, Andy Serkis did a pretty decent job as Alfred.
Okay. I think that was just like, you know, here's somebody who, and you know, Christopher Nolan likewise has done that different times, where like somebody who, you know, like kind of Matt Reeves has worked with Planet of the Apes, so Andy Serkis was like kind of like, oh, you know, kind of why not kind of choice and stuff, I think.
Yeah, I felt like he just did a slightly more, I mean, he basically just almost the same as Michael Caine, really. Just trying to do pretty much the same thing. I didn't really see much difference, but yeah, I actually thought Zoe Kravitz was very good as Catwoman. I thought she added quite a lot of sort of complexity to that character. And
ironically, in the previous casting, in the previous Batman and stuff like that, she was basically just told like, you know, like, oh, you know, kind of like they weren't going to consider her and stuff like that. So it's kind of like a little bit of comeuppance, where like for this one, she was like kind of one of the, you know, kind of primary choices and stuff like that, ironically.
Oh, did she also sort of go for the Anne Hathaway role then?
She wanted to, but she basically wasn't even like given like a casting, kind of like,
Oh,
they're
wow.
basically like, we're looking at somebody who's, I forget the term that they use and stuff, but it was something that's kind of like, basically saying like, we're not gonna, like consider somebody of color and stuff like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, it wasn't stated that way, of course, because you can't say
No,
that
no, no,
nowadays and everything.
no.
But it was basically like, I think it was something like where we wanted somebody who was less urban or something like
It's
that.
urban. God,
Something
that's so
like that was
ridiculous,
like
isn't
kind
it?
of
Yeah.
PC, but yet like really like kind of like
Mm,
at least like you're not gonna at least even just see her like I don't.
yeah. I mean, ironically, I thought actually, by the time they got to Catwoman, because that was in Dark Knight Rises, wasn't it? I kind
Yeah,
of,
yeah.
yeah, I felt like it kind of checked out as a franchise after the Dark Knight Returns. It was like the third Dark Knight. There's just a very obvious drop off in quality between 2 and 3 in the Christian Bale trilogy. I mean, it's still pretty good. It's not helped, of course, by Tom Hardy doing a ridiculous accent all the way through it. I mean, it's bad enough with Christian Bale there sort of growling away, but when you've got him and Tom Hardy doing a Sean Connery impression, it's just ludicrous. But anyway, yeah, so I thought, I actually thought they, in terms of the main sort of protagonist, I thought Robert Pattinson actually did a pretty decent job. I think it was the awkward sort of dysfunctional element that he added that really surprised me about that. I thought Zoe Kravitz was good. And it's kind of a shame because I think she would have actually brought a little more edge to Catwoman than Anne Hathaway did. And Anne Hathaway does a good job, but you kind of feel like Catwoman should be a bit more edgy than her. Still just a bit too clean cut for that role, in my opinion.
Right.
But it's interesting, this idea, like you said, that she didn't get it because of some sort of racial discrimination there, because of course white privilege is one of the themes, I would say, in this new Batman movie.
Right, of course.
It's this idea that there is no real benevolent establishment, that these wealthy families can exist without some people suffering or getting damaged along the way.
I think in some ways it's a sign of the times, and in some ways it's kind of like, because one of the things in the Joker movie and stuff was this idea of that people have their idea, their notions of what is and stuff like that. And I feel like that's kind of like just this conversation, we talk about mental illness and everything, but I think along with that is it's just people's kind of when somebody sees somebody on the street and stuff like that, and it's like like the judgments that we automatically come up and stuff like that, and different times like with the Joker, like he was just not going to be considered like somebody who was frontlining material, I guess, if you will, stuff like that. And so when he got managed to kind of get himself on the show and everything, again, major spoilers, he basically made this kind of very public statement of like that like okay, you don't think I'm right for the role, like kind of consider this, like kind of course, turns the gun on the host, stuff like that. And I feel like it's kind of like that there's this kind of over time this thing of that people now are being more considered for different roles, and it's kind of like where it's kind of like the blessing and curse of like kind of the cancel culture and the different things, like where like what I've seen personally from the other direction of things, so like behind the scenes, I guess, if you will, is that things like there's, you see more roles that call for POC, persons of color. You see more things like for ethnically ambiguous, like in other words, before the roles were like, okay, like what are you? You Asian or you're Caucasian, stuff. And then like now there's actually a separate category of ethnically ambiguous and stuff. So it's kind of like weird how like that over time we're kind of like little bit more open, but also like there's probably still some remnants of like kind of where people have their notions and but it's kind of like it's a little bit of a trade-off, you know, like as things have been going on and stuff.
Yeah, it's yeah, you're right. It's kind of there's this weird sort of hypocrisy with some of it in that it's like having the fact that you have a category that's ethnically ambiguous is kind of a little bit dodgy already. It's kind of like, yeah, we don't want you to be this, or this. We want you to be something that isn't all of those, or something we can't tell. And then that's so subjective as well. It's like whoever the casting couch, they could just be like really horrifically sheltered and never have seen anyone, and they just be like, oh, I didn't know what, you know, they fit in this. And you know, there's all sorts of things you could look at that. I mean, in terms of you know, that kind of effect, I kind of feel that you know, we had the new Doctor Strange movie that came out,
right.
Is basically, and I'm spoiling this a little bit, sorry for those, but it's basically the Scarlet Witch movie. But the thing is, Disney obviously knows they can't just make a Scarlet Witch movie because there weren't not enough people go and see it. So they call it Doctor Strange to get the probably predominantly male comic book fan base in to watch it, and then do a bait and switch, and it's basically the Scarlet Witch movie. But I mean, that's so cynical that they have to do that. You know, if they were really sort of gung-ho about being politically correct and doing all this stuff, they just call it the Scarlet Witch movie, or just make a movie about her instead. It just seems very kind of cowardly, really.
It's kind of odd though, because at the same time they managed to make the series, right? You know, with the character and stuff.
Yeah, and that was pretty bad as well.
but they managed to, you know, get the budget for it and to make it. You see what I'm saying? It's like I understand what you're saying, and I agree that, like, you know, they probably couldn't get her to, you know, be a headline for a movie, you know, because once again, oh, there's so much money involved, we can't do that, blah blah blah, whatever.
Yeah. But they could have done a more interesting, I don't know. It's you know, it's where the money comes in and the rubber hits the road, I suppose, in terms of marketing and what they're expecting. But yes, getting back to it in this movie, you know, it's interesting in that we kind of Bruce Wayne has this idea of his sort of perfect parents who are then you know, found out to be, well, actually they were corrupt in themselves, and it's left a little ambiguous. But you'd still kind of, and again, it goes back to the whole thing with mental illness, in that the reason he gets he tries to shut up this reporter because he doesn't want the stigma of his wife's mental illness being made public, because it will obviously affect his career as some sort of establishment figure. So I thought that was kind of interesting that they had first of all, that they sort of started pointing fingers at the sort of the Wayne parents and saying, you know, how good was your kind of orphanage program, and it really didn't work. And also the Bruce then having to sort of challenge the perception of his parents as well. So
definitely a lot, you know, like there's we'll probably have links for it, as somebody pointed out, that there's a lot of connections with Seven, which is actually a favorite, you know, David Fincher film of mine, with, you know, once again, Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt, that, you know, there's a lot of crime and a lot of, you know, they're a very dark kind of portrayal of, you know, like kind of mental illness. And also I think another similarity is that, like, we see a lot more of Gotham, that like it feels more like a filled out city in this you know, the 2022 version. Yeah, I would say, well, it felt pretty open in a lot of the 2005 ones. But yeah, obviously the limitations of creating the Metropolis-style fantasy sets of the 89 version couldn't permit them to have the same kind of range that they've done in both the 2005 and 2022. I mean, it felt like, even, you know, like kind of in the early, like, you know, say Tim Burton, stuff like that like a lot of times we were allowed to see the Gothams that, like, as long as it's within, you know, like kind of the racetrack, if you will, of the chase and stuff like that, and then otherwise we'll just like pan out, like, you know, whereas for this one we kind of really see you know, Batman kind of roaming, and like, you know, different times, like there's these different scenes that he's like just lurking, a lot more. It's like we really get to feel a little bit more of like kind of, although like what's funny is that like once again we have this scene of meeting at this, I don't know, construction site. It seems to be like kind of like that. This has become like the default, meeting place for Batman.
I know, yeah, that was a bit strange, wasn't it? That they always met in the same place. And I kind of felt that there was a lot of, okay, so whilst it was kind of there were interesting elements to the story, I felt visually it was actually quite lacking. And I felt this is where the 2005 was much stronger. Okay. Because you had this origin story that, was set in the mountains of Nepal or wherever it's supposed to be. And, and then it sort of pans to various different locations between sort of like the high rises of the elite sort of Bruce Wayne lifestyle down to the sort of the narrows where you have, the almost like the underclass of Gotham. So visually it was a lot more varied and just a bit more interesting. This kind of keeps the same kind of tonal palette the entire way through.
That's true. Yeah.
Again, it's like the Batmobile is a car, which is more this is just a car. And I can't remember, maybe I had a few gadgets and stuff, but I mean, basically, okay, it's more believable, but it's less visually interesting, and
it's a little bit less Batman, kind of like James Bond. We think of as having gadgets. Similarly, we think of Batman as having his array of toys.
yeah. So yeah, it does. I mean, you could keep going down this road of making Batman more and more believable to the point where it would just be, a TV detective show and he'd be called John Batman or something like that. And that would basically be the end result of this continuing trend.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, it's more believable. It's less fun, though. That's the problem. It's almost like the polar opposite of the 1960s version.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I thought, though, the really interesting thing about it for me, and like you said with it, well, we'll go back to your point of it being like Seven. What I thought was clever was the way the Riddler was kind of getting Batman to do his job for him. I thought that was kind of clever the way and that again plays into this idea of Batman in this version at least not being completely aware of everything that's going on, a little bit naive, a little bit delusional, which is a really interesting take compared to, because I mean, the Bruce Wayne of the Nolan films kind of knows exactly what he's doing. He's got a team of guys to help him. He's got endless resources. It's and it's kind of a similar in the 1989 version, only he doesn't even need the team. It's just him doing everything. So it's kind of even less believable. But yeah, I thought that was kind of clever, the way he kind of set him up. And, the way he kind of opened his eyes to the sort of corruption. And then that also,
I was going to say,
that makes this whole point of like, he's a vigilante and the Riddler also thinks he's a vigilante as well, because he's trying to copy him. But then, there's that fine line of between where does a vigilante become a terrorist? And it's clearly when you start killing innocent people. So the Riddler kind of like, even he falls into that terrorist angle rather than the other one.
I think in, Batman Begins, the way they kind of answer that question is that like, or in that series is the fact that like, well, as long as you're sanctioned, by the authorities, then you're like kind of okay then, because like we just can't have a bunch of dudes running around in costumes, because they even actually have like this moment where kind of different people started to do that, and then of course like kind of these guys end up getting killed, and that's kind of like how they kind of basically said, okay, like that's where we draw the line stuff. And then on the other hand, the other issue, like you said, is how there's this kind of decay of this society going on, and like what do you do when the very thing you're trying to save is also morally bankrupt? Like, I mean, I think that's an interesting question that the 2022 version covers, because you're seeing like all the different levels of people that are corrupt and stuff. Like that's something I feel like hasn't been really touched. It's just stated in like kind of the Christopher Nolan series and stuff.
Hmm.
But here we really get to see like kind of, just like the police are like, hanging out at these, seedy, clubs and stuff. And so we really see like kind of, how, like just this status quo is really messed up.
Yeah, and you see the workings of it much more. Yeah, and I think it's a sign of the times. I think there's obviously, people are much more mistrustful of the government and the establishment. I mean, I think it's no coincidence that you've got a movie like Joker, where basically you've got a person who's sort of inciting violence and challenging society as he's the protagonist, he's the hero, the one who's causing the uprising against the establishment. So it's we're in fourth turning times,
I was gonna say.
So yeah, I mean, it was, and it does leave you in this kind of place where you just kind of Batman 2022 leaves you in a place where you're kind of like, well, was it worth rooting for the Batman through this? Is anything really going to change? And what was the cost? I mean, it's very sort of simple differences really, and that Batman doesn't kill anyone, and the Riddler kills innocents, is prepared to kill innocent people to make his point. But of course, as we know from our previous discussion on early bits of the comics, Batman used to kill people, and it's only like after the 40s and 50s that 50s mostly, he stopped killing people. So he was throwing people off bridges. And I mean, my favorite thing that I looked up is the one where he's after, I think I may even spoke about this, is the one where he basically he's up against someone who's supposed to be a vampire, and he just finds his coffin and just shoots him in the coffin. I just think that's this great, hilarious. But anyway, it's it's good the way they kind of balance those two characters out and make you sort of feel like they're much closer in motive than would normally be portrayed in a superhero movie, we'll say.
I think that's overall what the 2022 version does, is it explores some different areas that probably have been neglected in the past. It kind of like does it also is pretty interesting way, like basically using that kind of seven, I guess, if you will, for like a little bit of a framework for things. It was an interesting choice. I think where it kind of falls short was like it just had a lot of fat. I mean, it just was not a lean movie at all at nearly 3 hours. I mean, I felt myself. I'll admit that like I kind of fell asleep, like watching it in the theater. I was like, the movie's there's something kind of seriously wrong, I guess, when you're in the theater and kind of like granted it was comfy in the air conditioning stuff, but I think it just like kind of it just says something about like kind of the movie and stuff when it's a an action film for that matter.
Well, yeah, I mean it's not really an action movie, I would say.
Okay.
Per se. I mean, there is some fight scenes and stuff, but I mean, again, for me, it was just visually a little uninspiring. We had the first fight is in a nightclub. I mean, like, how many movies have you watched where there's been like a fight in a nightclub? It's, Nolan at least had it on a glacier in the middle of Nepal or wherever it's supposed to be, and it's very visually arresting. But or with surrounded by ninjas, whereas this is kind of it's a fight in a nightclub. The car chase was a car chasing another car, and something explodes and the car goes over the top. There you go. I mean, it's nothing that we haven't seen a lot of times before from a visual perspective. Agreed. Yeah, it was almost like I think you could have taken the script and you could have almost do a Marvel thing, which is where they get another director to do the action sequences, and you get someone to do the conversations and the plot points. So that was my main, and of course, yes, it's just very, very long. I had to watch it in 2 sittings.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I watched it on HBO now, so yeah.
Sure. Okay, so I appreciate that it wasn't just me that like felt like it was just kind of like just really just like, okay, when you're starting to kind of like check the time, it's that's not a good sign.
No. And I mean, the feeling of it though was that it didn't feel like a very high budget blockbuster movie. I'm sure it was expensive, but I mean, it felt more like a kind of a Disney Plus show. It kind of
Interesting.
felt
Yeah,
like a sort of.
I can see
It
that.
could you could have made it into 3 episodes and put it on Disney Plus, and it would have been like just as good, really. And I think this also kind of goes back to, we were talking about this this was something that was mentioned in I think it was Neurotics Friday Night Tights thing, where they were saying that, or maybe it was from a Critical Drinker video, where they're saying, you know, a lot of movies are becoming more like content and less like art. And this, I felt, was more like a kind of a, you know, something that would have been better on Netflix than.
Right.
And I mean, it was perfect for HBO Now, in all fairness. That was probably why I came away with it maybe slightly more positive than you, because I didn't actually have to physically go to the cinema to watch it. But yeah, it's kind of felt like, and it's, yeah, that's kind of what a lot of the new Marvel stuff feels like as well. It just feels like slightly low key TV fare.
That's the thing. Like nowadays, I think we've always kind of been pretty picky about what we actually go to the movie theater to see. After COVID, I feel like we're even more picky. But this one, I probably would not have seen if it was not something that we were going to discuss, to be honest. It just like you said, visually, I just did not feel like it was something I wanted to, or felt that I really was driven to see on a big screen. You know, just it just was something that kind of like seemed like it is more almost like designed for something to watch, you know, like kind of in the comfort of your home and stuff like that, rather than, you know, going out to a theater. Because to me, like that's part of, you know, the going to the movie theaters experiences. You feel like this something that like you want to see that's cinematic, and that you feel like it's an experience that, you know, you literally want to see on a big screen.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you sort of criticize Christopher Nolan for having fairly sort of bland color palettes visually, you know, there's always some pretty arresting visual images in his movies. It's worth going to this, you know, you feel like you're getting a visual experience when you go and watch one of his movies. Definitely. As I say, this felt like not a TV movie would be a bit harsh, because I just equate that with the 80s and 90s TV movies, but it felt like something that worked just as well streaming at home.
Yeah, agreed. Alrighty. So coming up, we'll definitely going to start looking at the Japanese anime versions of different movies that have kind of gone from comic to on screen and then some stuff. The first one we'll be looking at will be Ghost in the Shell, and definitely we'll be looking at other ones after that. So I'm once again John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will see you at the movies.